Hello and welcome to this edition of the Redaction Politics Podcast with me, James Moules. Today we're going to be talking about, of course, the hot topic of the day, the United States presidential election. At time of recording, it is 1 month to the day until the big day, until the ballots are cast. Donald Trump was recently diagnosed with COVID-19. His situation is still ongoing at the time of this podcast. We are recording this at 7:30 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time on the 3rd of October 2020. So please bear that in mind when you listen to this podcast. We are also recording this just after the first debate. This is our first edition of this podcast since then. Richard, I'm going to come to you first. How is the diagnosis going to affect the presidential race?
I mean, where to start? Goodness gracious me. Well, it's amazing to think that the debate was this week. It's amazing to think that we were talking about Supreme Court nominees this week. So much has happened. So obviously we had the debate on Tuesday night, which you probably can't really call a debate. It was largely Trump and interrupting Joe Biden, sort of just
insult tennis, wasn't it?
Yeah, doing his best to steamroll over the top of both Chris Wallace, the moderator of Fox News, and Joe Biden as well. Since then, obviously, Trump has had some fairly dire press and the response to the debate. A couple of post-debate polls have been released. There was one that had Biden up 13 points nationally, and there's a poll where he was up 7 in Pennsylvania and 5 in Florida. So everything points to the fact that the debate has not gone well for Trump. And the American people seem to agree. But then the bombshell on Thursday evening was that the president was diagnosed with coronavirus, having been a part of many outdoor events, namely the one in the Rose Garden where he introduced the Supreme Court nominee, Amy Coney Barrett, to the world. There were many people who weren't wearing masks, etc. And it would seem that perhaps that was the time where he was infected with the virus. So at the time of recording, he's currently in Walter Reed Military Hospital. There has been a diagnosis, a press conference from his team of doctors a few hours ago now, which was largely positive. Tried to paint a picture that the president was up, he was working, he was joking, and I mean, in a moment of take politics off for a minute. Obviously we do wish him well. I wouldn't wish this on my worst enemy.
Absolutely.
Even though I loathe him politically, and I think I don't make any bones about that. I would absolutely never wish him death or sickness. So I do hope he recovers speedily. But we do have to consider the political implications with only a month to go until the election. Again, I don't know is probably the three most common words that you're probably going to hear from this podcast. We were mentioning last week that Trump, the strong man, that image is going to be tarnished now because he's got COVID, but it's very hard to know exactly how this is going to play out politically. I've heard some people say this is going to hurt him for that reason, and also because he's behind in the polls and he needs these 2 weeks to get out there and engage with voters. But equally, there could be a rally around the leader kind of moment. There could be an outpouring of sympathy. I don't think it's as likely, but there's every chance that he could end up ever so slightly better off after this, politically speaking. But I think in the sort of the immediate future, we need to consider what might happen. The president's health may deteriorate, and obviously there is larger implications at play if it does.
Okay, just before we go on, I probably ought to, of course, introduce the team we have here. You just heard from our reporter Richard Hansen, and we're also joined by reporter Mason Quah. How's everyone doing today?
I've been looking at my Twitter quite frequently today, knowing that I was going to be recording this podcast at 7:30 British summertime, just to keep across everything, because how much of what I think is going to be valid hour by hour. So
I got that push notification on my phone last night saying that Trump had gone to hospital, and I thought, okay, I'm not going to be sleeping tonight. I'm just going to be checking Twitter all night long, aren't I?
Mm.
I've got a entire page of notes on my monitor in front of me about something that is no longer the biggest headline of this podcast.
Well, we'll get on to the debate a bit later, but one point I'd just like to raise is that we all live in the UK, and of course, earlier in this year, we saw a very similar scenario where Boris Johnson, our Prime Minister, was diagnosed with COVID-19 after going around and boasting about shaking people's hands in a hospital. Of course, not a fan of him politically myself, but we all wished him well. He was subsequently taken to hospital and then placed in the intensive care unit. He was on oxygen, and it was a serious threat to his life at the time. He did pull through, and he is now in the top spot again. This sounds like a familiar tale, doesn't it?
It does, but I think it's a little bit different in the sense that Boris Johnson wasn't facing the electorate 1 month in advance. He could spend the time, focus on getting better, and some of his able lieutenants could take over the reins for him, front those press conferences, etc. I think the biggest thing at play at the moment is that Trump has the election to fight one month today. And so therefore he's going to have half an eye, or more than half an eye, on that, no matter how he's feeling. I think there's a couple of interesting things to note at the moment. I think they probably have played it down so slightly. He publicized that he was diagnosed on Thursday night. The doctors who gave the press conference a few hours ago said he's been diagnosed at least 72 hours, which means he's probably diagnosed Wednesday night. He may have even had the virus on Tuesday night, which was the debate night. Joe Biden has since tested negative for COVID. But it's also important to remember that Trump arrived late to the debate and therefore was unable to have a COVID-19 test before he took the debate stage. So there's every chance he could have tested positive on Tuesday night. So at the moment, it's very difficult to know what to believe.
Yeah. Like, the Trump administration at this point does not have a good reputation for being honest about the issues that it's facing. I think, if we're going to be making comparisons to Boris Johnson, there is the other important comparison to make, which is to Hillary Clinton 4 years ago. She had pneumonia while on the campaign trail, and that was a very powerful line of attack for Trump. The implications that, because she had fallen ill, there were questions about whether or not her health would be compromised as a leader, and what that would mean for.
Of course, with that footage that got widely circulated of Hillary Clinton collapsing as she was getting into the car after an event.
Mm-hmm. I was reminded today of the phrase. Well, many politicians have said it, but most recently Michelle Obama said it. When they go low, we go high. And so you've seen Joe Biden pull all negative advertising from his campaign. So you're right, Mason. 4 years ago, Trump jumped upon that, mocked Hillary Clinton, did everything he could to weaponize her illness. But it seems like the Democrats are going in the opposite direction. Whether that is successful remains to be seen. I think it probably is. It's going to give Joe Biden some space and some ability to look presidential without having somebody constantly rebutting him, and he can talk a little bit about issues.
I'm not so sure if I agree that pulling, the attack ads is the right move. I think that, anybody who would be appeased by that kind of respectability politics is already on the side of Joe Biden. There's no real demographic that actually gets swung over by Biden trying to pull his punches.
Yeah, though I think it's important to remember that Biden is quite far ahead already. So he's probably at a point where he's thinking, right, I'm just going to defend my lead now. I think if he goes on the attack, I think he's more likely to lose voters, especially from the left. Maybe not too directly to Trump, but those people might stay home. So I think he's just doing his best to kind of preserve the lead. He's got 7 or so points nationally and an electoral college lead. I think I've seen the most recent analysis on realclearpolitics.com. If Biden won every state he's currently ahead in, he would have 375 electoral votes, which is 100 more than he needs, 105 more than he needs.
Yeah.
So I think there's something to be said for that. Trump similarly is going to be denied these 2 weeks, desperately needs to turn this campaign around for him. And it seems that the way that he wants to do that is to hold large, in-person, maskless rallies. Well, it seems like his chickens have come home to roost.
It strikes me with Trump, though, that I think there's an extent to which he's reached a ceiling of support. That there are very few people now he's going to be able to win over. His tactic now is to convince as many people who might vote for Biden to stay at home.
Yes.
Hence, to bring it onto the debate already, he was talking at one point on the subject of law and order, and on several other topics. He was sort of saying, are you going to lose the radical left vote now? Or are you the radical left? That was one of his attack lines.
It was.
And we saw this when he said, we need to go back to our core values, he said. These people, they're teaching us to hate our country. I mean, what does this mean? But at the same time, is this going to be an effective attack line for Trump when he's painting this image that, the education has been taken over by the radical left, and this is what is going to happen to America if Biden wins?
It may have been, but we won't know now because the next story has come to the forefront. He has coronavirus and he's currently in hospital, potentially fighting for his life. So that's what's going to lead the news, whether Trump likes it or not. It goes back to what I said. It does not allow Trump to continue playing the campaign the way he wants to play it. He is not in control of this anymore. He is not in control of the message. It's also interesting to see how infrequently he's been tweeting. And there was a good 12-hour period where America was awake and Donald Trump hadn't tweeted, which very much surprised me. And it suggests that maybe he's not as well as he'd like to project.
Don't know how many people have seen the new episode of Spitting Image yet. Have either of you?
No, I'm afraid not.
Okay, I'll leave that tangent then. But there is something they allude to there on that note. But did both of you watch the debate then?
I had to turn it off a few times. Sort of mental health breaks. What about you, Mason?
I wasn't able to watch it live. 5-7 hour time gap. It was too much for me. My soul was willing, my body was weak, but I was able to catch it all the next day.
Yeah, it was. In some ways, I know before this whole COVID story happened, we were talking about, ways in which the Electoral Commission can perhaps change the debates to make it more debate-like with a mute button or something, having the candidates' microphones turned off if they're speaking out of turn. Well, the next debate is supposed to happen on the 15th of October, and I would be extremely surprised if that occurs now.
Is there any chance that there could be a televised debate, if it could be live streamed from various locations?
I mean, it could be, but I'm not sure that the president's health is going to allow it to be.
I mean, you're quite right. It'll depend on Trump's health. I mean, if he only from here on out has mild symptoms, then it's still a possibility, I guess. But I mean, from the way it's looking, he could. I mean, it's difficult to say at this point. Like you say, the 3 words that will define this podcast are "I don't know," but.
I mean, I think one of 2 things are going to happen with Trump's response. And I'm not going to say until the end which one I think to happen. So he's either going to
you better stay through to the end then, haven't you?
So he's either going to have a serious episode here, COVID, and he's going to come through it, and he's going to have a newfound respect for the disease. I know he was caught on. Audio recordings were leaked back in February that he knew that it was a serious illness, and he was trying to downplay it to the American people. But he could come through this, and he could be like, no, this is very serious, guys. And public health in general would probably benefit from that. Never mind the election. America might get hold of its coronavirus numbers, or he has a mild case. Has mild symptoms. He comes through it. He says, "Look, I took." What was the wonder drug that he hung his hat on? Not bleach. He doesn't need to have a drip of bleach into his arm.
I'm not going to try to pronounce
it. UV light injected into the veins.
Yeah, hydroxychloroquine, something like that.
Hydroxychloroquine.
Hydroxychloroquine. So it's either serious or it's mild, and he comes through this and he says, "See, it's no big deal."
I think the former scenario is what we'll call the Boris Johnson scenario. The way it goes after that is you still manage to be completely incompetent in office.
Indeed. Well, who knows how long that's gonna last for? But if the polls continue to the way that they are, he's not going to be in office for much longer. I think on a slight tangent as well, it's important to remember that he's not the only one that's been that's tested positive for coronavirus out of his circle. You've got the First Lady, obviously. Governor Chris Christie has just recently been tested positive, but most importantly, 3 Republican senators have tested positive for coronavirus. Now, that is going to have huge implications for the Supreme Court confirmation hearings. The Republicans hold a majority, 53-47 in the Senate. 2 Republican senators have already come out and said that they won't consider a nominee until after the election. So if these 3 are now, the 3 further are now incapacitated, Mitch McConnell doesn't have the numbers, and he may have to wait until after the election to see if he can get Trump's nominee through.
Because, of course, it doesn't matter if certain senators don't turn up, because, it does matter, because in the case of Brett Kavanaugh, not every senator voted. It was only 50-48 that approved Brett Kavanaugh. So even if there are depleted numbers, and especially if they are Republicans, that could massively favor the Democrats.
Yeah, and the Democrats are certain to have 47 votes on that floor. So if the Republicans have fewer than that, it's going to be very, very difficult to get any kind of confirmation through. So they're not. So the Democrats 47, you'll have 2 Republicans. There's 49. That doesn't leave a lot of room for.
How do we see that going?
I think it all depends on Trump's health again. I mean, it's like I said, the overarching 3 words of this podcast. I don't know. I think the next probably 72 hours are going to be quite crucial. Keep your eye on your Twitter feeds. I think that it's going to be interesting to see what the White House are trying to project, and what other rumors and things you're hearing swirling around. I imagine that the White House will be trying to say that this is nothing too serious, but equally, if there are other rumors that are swirling around on the contrary, then who knows what to believe.
I think that, like severe or mild case, it's going to be downplayed by the White House. Trump could come out of a severe case that nearly kills him, and he would spin that into an attack angle on China.
Yes, that's true, but I'm not sure that wins him too many votes anyway.
I don't think it does anymore. He's increasingly signaling to a smaller and smaller faction of the American populace that hold the most hardcore beliefs. And then he relies on the broader Republican Party to sort of consolidate around him to carry everything else.
Like you said earlier, there's not going to be enough time necessarily for him to make any kind of argument that sticks. And it's going to be very hard for him to turn this on to Joe Biden if Joe Biden continues to not be negative. If Joe Biden just continues on and talks about his healthcare plan and talks about him, just being generally presidential and just generally having kind of positive hopes, positivity for the country, and we're all in this together. If you look at a lot of his messaging, it's a lot about like, I'm not going to be the president for Democrats, I'm going to be the president for all Americans. So he's very much just trying to give the nation a big warm cuddle.
How many Americans are going to buy that though?
Well, he doesn't need any more than he's already got. So I think his strategy is just to try not to lose the ones he already has. And it's Trump that needs to do something to change the race. I think also, we forgot about this, Trump's tax returns as well. Remember that? Remember Trump's tax returns? That was this week, right?
Yeah.
Revealed
it's been a slow news week, hasn't it, like you say?
Revealed that he paid only $750 in federal income tax in 2016. I feel he's obviously listened, or Joe Biden, or somebody in the New York Times has obviously listened to our podcast, because last week I said, I suppose maybe Joe Biden could bring Trump's tax returns to the debate. Well, he kind of did, in a way. I know he didn't break it himself, but he definitely had the ammunition. So it's just another...
You have to wonder how long they were sitting on that one.
Oh, of course. Yes,
yeah.
They're very much waiting for the appropriate moment to...
Much like I imagined last time round, it was for the Hollywood Access tapes.
Yes.
I do think, though, that the way that the tax returns are being used rhetorically is not the best. The idea that, Trump isn't paying enough taxes. To Trump's base, like him paying only $700 of taxes isn't a negative. It's him going against the system yet again. It's him being the libertarian that we all dream about. And I think, that's something that can be spun into a strong point. But I think the most revealing thing from those leaked documents is the sheer quantity of debt that he's in and how many of his businesses are failing. And I think that is the attack angle that would be more easily exploited, because Trump came to power on the promise that he was some fantastic businessman who was descending down from up on high in order to save America and revitalize the economy. And then during the booming economy he's so proud of, he wasn't able to turn a profit.
It takes an amazing... I was just going to say, it takes an amazing level of incompetence to run a casino business into the ground, which has nothing more than to take money away from the punter. Just saying.
And of course in Las Vegas he has this really tastefully designed gold-plated hotel tower. But speaking of somebody who's destined to save America, of course, where does this leave QAnon? I'm almost reluctant to bring this up, because I don't want to give this conspiracy theory any more of a platform than it needs. But I mean,
depending on the version of the conspiracy, because like QAnon largely disseminated through 4chan, there are always anonymous people that are just adding their own spins to the narrative. So depending on which version is to your preference, Trump being infected with COVID was all part of the plan, because actually they were going to secretly give it to him on election night to try and assassinate him. And depending on who you ask, they is either Israel or China.
I've had a number of American friends talk to me about conspiracy theories in the last few days, and I firmly believe that the only way to make the conspiracy theorists, I'm not going to say go away, that's impossible, but quiet in the most, is by defeating Trump at the ballot box. If Trump's health descends even further, and he's incapacitated to the point where he has to invoke the 25th Amendment, or heaven forbid he dies, and the 20th Amendment comes in, and Vice President Pence becomes president, these conspiracy theorists are going to explode.
Is it already too late though, with certain groups that have already been emboldened by the Trump presidency? For example, we all saw at the Charlottesville rally, we wouldn't have 5 years ago seen people walking around emboldened in public with literal Nazi flags.
I think that's the thing. Win or lose, there is going to be political violence immediately following the election. Either Trump wins and they see their worldview is like they see the right chance to assert their worldview, or Trump loses and they think now's the time, we have to start the civil war.
Or as we spoke about in the last podcast, one of them wins by a very small margin, and both camps are violent. So you're right. There's only bad options in the weeks ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. Is there any part of the debate that struck you the most?
Apart from Donald Trump refusing to abide by the rules, I think Jake Tapper of CNN summed it up quite well. I think he said it was a hot mess inside a dumpster fire, inside a shit show, and that's something along those lines. I don't think there's any part of that debate that we can kind of say, maybe some undecided voters heard something that they liked and they managed to support one candidate or the other. Maybe some undecideds thought, I'm going to support Joe Biden because Donald Trump is completely unhinged, maybe. But it's very, very difficult to talk about any kind of policy or any kind of platform, because they didn't talk about it at all. It was just both of them slinging mud from what was it, 12 feet away or so.
Socially distanced, we hope.
No, well, Biden has tested negative for COVID. I mean, could you imagine if both of them got sick? That would be unbelievable. But it's going to be interesting in the next couple of weeks to see how many of Trump's surrogates kind of try and take the mantle. Are they going to dare to hold some of these rallies? There were things. Trump cancelled a massive MAGA rally in Orlando, in Florida. I think it was supposed to be maybe last night or this evening. But you could see people like Don Jr., you could see the vice president, you could see other surrogates, Rudy Giuliani, various members of the US Congress trying to take his place. Ivanka Trump, perhaps. But again, all of these things remain to be seen, and whether or not this helps him.
I do think that, so much of the mythos is nucleated around Trump to the point that I don't think anyone's going to be able to just easily just step into that place.
Mm-hmm.
There are so many narratives and conspiracies that would need to be rewritten to accommodate, a second God emperor.
Yeah, I mean, he is.
Add the letters JR at the end.
Yeah, indeed. It's like I said, I do not know what's going to happen. I mean, we could sit here this time next week and there'll be a completely different narrative. I mean, it's probably important to say just that if Trump did pass away, heaven forbid, then Pence would become the president for now. The process of who is in the election is a bit more complicated than that, because it would then be up to various Republican delegations to nominate another candidate. And there's no historical precedent for that. So I imagine probably what would happen is, because Pence is already on the ballot and people have already voted, that Pence would sort of become the Republican nominee. But that would be a crisis almost unheard of in the history of the US Republic.
With the idea of the Trump mythos, though, is there a flip side to that? That there are some moderate Republicans who are only going for Biden now because of Trump? And if Trump were out of the picture, might go back to the red camp?
Possibly. But equally, I think there's probably a lot of dyed-in-the-wool Trump supporters who would stay home if Trump wasn't on the ballot. Again, we're talking hypotheticals here, and it's very hard to know. But, I don't know ethos for the night.
I think President Pence is an even harder sell than President Trump. Trump has the charisma to back up his complete lack of policy positions. But, Pence is better at conniving. He's a much more effective political agent, but his goals are not as well aligned to the Trump fan base, and he also doesn't really have the rhetorical power to back it up.
I mean, he's the pound shop Dick Cheney.
That's a very good way of explaining it.
I like the way John Oliver put it. Mike Pence is the exact opposite of what a silver fox is.
Indeed, I hear his wife is the one that pulls the strings, who, funnily enough, his name is Karen. So she's got a very appropriate name. But you're right. You're definitely correct, Mason. I think it's a lose-lose, because not only does Pence not really have the charisma, it would also take a lot longer than 30 days for him to build up policy positions and have people fall in behind them. So if that happens, it would just be I would surely Joe Biden would have to be successful in November.
I think there is a large faction of the population who, when they hear the name Mike Pence, just, yes, the electroshock therapy guy. Because there's a very limited number of things that he is, that he does have his name attached to that are in the public consciousness. He's been a much more background figure than Donald Trump has.
Yeah, and that was always going to be his goal, is to simply stand there and agree with whatever Trump says.
Well, that was part of the point with Mike Pence, wasn't it? He was just this fairly bland, grey character who was there to counterbalance and kind of not interfere with the Trump character.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was a bit of red meat being thrown to more conventional moderate Republicans and also to evangelicals. I was
about to say, he's more in the evangelical wing, Mike Pence, isn't he?
Yes, but he's certainly more of I say establishment Republicans. He's spent time in the US Congress. He knows Washington. He knows the swamp that Donald Trump so desperately wanted to drain 4 years ago. We don't hear that anymore, really, do we? Drain the swamp.
No. Of course, I mean, there were other Republicans who were absolutely gagging for that vice presidential slot, including Chris Christie and Newt Gingrich, weren't there? But he said it for Mike Pence, who nobody had heard of beforehand.
No.
Unless you were in... And I think that was part of the point, is he was somebody who was from the Midwest.
Yeah.
Governor of Indiana. Near to Iowa, near to Ohio, two states that flipped to Trump.
Indeed, and there was a talk of having Ivanka on the ticket before cooler heads prevailed. Trump. It would have been even more interesting. But like I said, we just don't know what's going to happen. I think we need to keep an eye on the news hour by hour over the next few days, because anything could break at any time, really.
Yeah, I think there is, at the end of the day, only really one solution for us here, and that is to record 5 different versions of this podcast and have Declan publish whichever one is correct.
Yeah,
absolutely.
It's a bit like Boris Johnson writing a column for Remain and a column for Leave, and falling behind whichever one he liked the most. But yeah, so either Trump gets better and continues, or he doesn't, or he has a serious bout of COVID and is perhaps scared into believing it all, or he doesn't get better, and then there are obviously graver concerns. So only time will tell, guys, and we're going to be here to cover it all right up until election night.
Absolutely. For a bit of balance, let's bring it over to Joe Biden for a minute. How did he perform in the debate?
He was doddering. He wasn't his best self. If you look at clips of Joe Biden from 30 years ago, he's certainly not as sharp as he was. I'm not for a minute suggesting that he's got Alzheimer's.
Well, he's had the hair plugs now, that's for sure.
He has, I'm not in a minute suggesting that he's got some kind of, debilitating condition that should prevent him from being president. But he didn't have a great night either. It's just that he was up against a raging dumpster fire. And so I think if Trump didn't go so hard on him like that, didn't just try and interrupt constantly, I think he probably could have exposed a few of Biden's flaws. I think it would have been a much fairer debate, and I think Biden, in a funny old way, probably should thank Trump for going too hard.
I do think that's both an important point in talking about the night, and also something that I think is worth to consider further in whatever hypothetical future debates are or are not cancelled. Because I think that the single best outcome for debate number 2 is Biden continues to go to Trump with the minor jabs that he's able to get away with, and just keep going just slightly enough that the president's microphone gets cut off from interrupting too often. I think that would be the most effective way of just dismantling the sort of the budget power plays that Trump tries to do in the debates.
Yes.
And there's often a line that gets wheeled out whenever sort of presidents are a bit mild during these debates. They say, the commentators will say, oh yes, they were doing their best to look presidential. Trump has none of that.
No.
Obviously to his supporters, that's part of his appeal. And as I say, I think he's probably reached a ceiling in support. The question is how many Biden supporters will stay at home. And that's what's going to decide the election at this point.
We also know that the debates normally aren't really about policy. They're more about the one-liners, the sound bites that will get played over and over again for free on the news for the following news cycle. So, I can think of Biden saying, "Shut up, man," and I can think of Biden saying, "You're the worst president we've ever had."
Well, think of it in 2016. What was the line? It was, "Can you trust Donald Trump with our judicial system? Because you'd be in jail."
Yes. Exactly, and that was a zinger that Trump got over Hillary, and that really galvanized his supporters.
And that does mean, though, that we need to talk about the one zinger from Trump that everyone has been clipping and sharing and talking about, which is telling the Proud Boys to stand by. Stand
up and stand by. Indeed, yeah. It's a dog whistle to his far right wing supporters. And at this point, it's all he's got, really.
Well, they even brought up that. Find people on both sides at Charlottesville line.
Indeed, he's not one to ever disregard any level of support. If he knows that white supremacists are in the tank for him, even if he disagrees with them, he's not gonna say anything to annoy them. So yeah.
What was it during 2016? Didn't he pretend to not know who David Duke was?
I think so. Yeah. For anybody out there who doesn't know who David Duke was, he was the Grand Wizard of the KKK.
Don't Google him. Don't Google him.
No.
You will end up on a watch list if you Google him. No. So don't.
And I think it is important to remember that, if I remember correctly,
just watch the film Black Klansman.
Yes.
From follow-up statements, Trump did sort of step back from that, from his Proud Boys comment. He claimed afterwards to not know who they were.
Yeah, and his surrogates tried to walk it back, and members of the Republicans in Congress tried to walk it back. But the Trump playbook doesn't allow for that. Is double down, triple down, keep punching, and you'll probably come out on top. And so I was thinking about this a lot with this COVID diagnosis. It's very hard to see how the Trump playbook will fit in with this. He's forced to quarantine now. There's nothing he can do about that. For somebody who is so good at bucking conventional wisdom and breaking convention, it's going to be hard to see how he's going to double down and triple down and keep punching for the next couple of weeks, and it's only going to benefit his opponent.
Where does the Bernie wing of the Democratic Party come into this? Do you think Biden's doing a good job at sort of doing that balancing act of appealing to the moderates and appealing to the left at the same time? Because that was one attack line Trump kept wheeling out during that debate is, you're now in the pocket of the radical left, he was claiming.
I mean, Trump alternated between two completely opposite lines at will, right? Biden is simultaneously in the pocket of the radical left, and anytime he says something that's not aligned with them, he just lost the radical left. Yeah. And I think that sort of characterizes the thing as a whole. I think he is managing to tread that line. He's not lost the radical left. We know how tactical voting works.
Exactly. Enough of the sensible radical left, and I say the sensible radical left, 90% of the radical left, understand that this election is about getting rid of Donald Trump. Nothing more than that.
Even though Chomsky said vote for Biden.
Exactly. And, Bernie Sanders has been a lot nicer about Joe Biden than he was ever about Hillary Clinton this time. And he's, making media appearances, surrogates. He's doing everything he can to make sure that Biden gets elected. I would be very surprised if Biden if he gets elected, I'll be very surprised if he sees out the whole presidential term. I imagine after the next series of midterms, he may resign and have Harris take over. And then is probably the time to start having a debate about the future direction of the Democratic Party.
I mean, I think I genuinely, assuming Biden wins and assuming we're going on to 2024 with Kamala Harris as the establishment favorite, I'm genuinely interested to see what a sort of Kamala Harris v AOC primary is going to look like. That would be fascinating.
It'd be fascinating, and it would be a time to start talking about ideas.
I think that if Biden wins, then I think from day one it is then fair game to start picking apart his failures from a leftward position.
Absolutely right, and it very much depends on what the makeup of the Congress looks like as well. I think obviously the Democrats are likely to hold the House, but it depends on what those Congress people look like. Are they radical left Democrats, or are they more centrist? And I think that's the direction that it can probably go in.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, now's the time for anyone even vaguely left-leaning to, UAF, Unite Against Fascism. That's what this vote in this election has got to be.
Yes.
From then on, if you're on the left, you can oppose Biden all you want.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think anybody on this podcast would have voted for Biden in the primary had we had the option, had we been US citizens. But yeah, I completely agree. There's absolutely no other priority this time other than getting rid of Donald Trump.
Agreed. Well, before we wrap things up, I think that sounded like a fairly final note, but just before we go, let's have a bit of fun again and have a look at some of the swing states, shall we?
Sure. There's some swingier swing states now.
There are some swingier swing states now. One we didn't mention last time round that I neglected to talk about was North Carolina. Where do we reckon that's leaning?
It's leaning blue at the moment. There's, the Senate race is competitive as well. So I think if I was a betting man, which I am, I'd be putting my money on Biden in North Carolina.
Are you actually putting your money on Biden?
No comment. But if I was, I'd be putting my money on Joe Biden in North Carolina. The direction of the polls seems to suggest that he's doing well. His support in Virginia is bleeding down into North Carolina, and he's had some really encouraging polls in Georgia as well. Even a couple of encouraging polls in South Carolina. I don't think he's going to take South Carolina, but North Carolina, I think, will go back into the vice president's column, and it'll help him get 270. And if he loses the odd state in the Midwest, it'll matter less.
Because there was a massive moment with Obama that he swung North Carolina and swung Indiana, of course. In fact, it was even a moment that he swung Virginia, even though we're not even talking about Virginia now. Virginia is very much in the blue column these days.
Absolutely, and because of the changing demographics. But another state I'd like to talk about is Iowa. I don't know if you saw a couple of polls more recently that there was one, I think, was Biden up 2 or 3 points in Iowa, which is a huge turnaround considering, didn't Trump win it by double digits in 2016?
He certainly won it fairly comfortably, yeah.
Yeah. So,
that's a state Obama won 2 times. We should clarify there.
Absolutely, but it one that swung quite heavily back to Trump in 2016.
Yes.
So, if Biden's in with a shot in Iowa, then we're probably talking landslide territory. I mean, Iowa, Georgia. I know 4 weeks ago.
And Nebraska second.
The suburbs of Omaha as well could give their electoral vote to Joe Biden. So I mean, these are, he's more likely to rack up 300 and something electoral votes if he's going to be winning those states.
And what about Georgia, though? Come on, I didn't let this one die last time.
I think it's going to depend on what happens over the next few weeks. Like I said, if Biden is really far ahead nationally, then Georgia's in play, like in the same way that Texas is in play. He doesn't need them. So
I think Georgia's more likely than Texas, to be honest.
Yes. I think Iowa is more likely than Georgia, but so in order of likelihood, you've got Iowa and then Georgia and then Texas. But these are states which might go blue, but Biden isn't going to really be too bothered because he has a path through so many other states to get to 270. And as we saw 4 years ago, Hillary took the Midwest for granted. She pulled out of Michigan. She pulled out of Wisconsin, thinking that these states were going to be in the bag for her. And she tried to spread herself too wide. Biden doesn't seem to be doing that, despite the fact that his numbers in Arizona are great. His numbers in Georgia are looking encouraging, Iowa, South Carolina, and even Texas. I even saw a poll in Alaska that had him only down by a few points. So at this point in time, anything is possible.
And then over here in the UK, we saw a similar scenario just last year. All those old industrial heartlands that usually voted for the centre-left party.
Indeed, we could be shattering the red wall this time. I think, but red being Republican rather than Labour. So, I don't think Biden's going to be,
Well, I meant that in the context of the 2016 election, but yeah.
Sure, but we could see the opposite thing happening now, where with other, more red-leaning states flipping blue because of Trump's unpopularity as a character. So anything is possible. But
I mean, demographically, like you say, I think Texas and Georgia in the long term are going to be very much in play for the Democrats. The question is whether they are now. And, for the Republicans, given that Texas may soon be in play, it's going to be even more vital for them in the long run that they hold the Midwest.
Yeah, and I think we're talking if Biden wins. I think once Trump is sort of out of the way, I think the Republicans are going to have a long, hard look at themselves and if they want to become electable into the future, because I think enough people will have seen the error of their ways, perhaps.
Just one more question I'd like to bring up before we wrap up. A hypothetical. Sure. If it weren't for the pandemic, do you think Trump would be in a better position to win?
Yes. Because the economy would be...
Okay, but I mean, I guess that's obvious, but do you think he would win is more my question.
I think yes.
I think as an incumbent, you've got a lot more structural advantages, which I've said before. I mean, we could talk hypotheticals. You could say if James Comey didn't send his second letter on October the 24th, 2016, then we'd be having President Clinton. So... coulda, shoulda, woulda. But I do think that if the pandemic wasn't a thing, or perhaps if the US managed to ride the wave a bit more, maybe not quite be the number one in terms of cases and deaths, per 100,000 or whatever it is, Trump would be in a much better place than he is now.
Okay. Any final thoughts anyone wants to share?
Get well soon. I really do. I really hope he pulls through.
Yeah, and I think that just as long as we're making predictions, I think one last thing that we should try and speculate on is the outsider, the Yellows, Jorgensen. How do we feel? Do the Libertarians stand a chance?
Well, they've not had a sort of Gary Johnson Aleppo-esque gaffe yet, so
I hope not. And I don't mean any disrespect to genuine libertarians, but that was part of the reason why Trump was elected in the first place.
Yeah.
Because people who were so against Clinton as a person thought, right, well, this time I'm going to lend my vote to the libertarians, and in my humble opinion, waste their vote in that political environment. If we had proportional representation in the US, then we'd be talking about something else. I hope that Jorgensen is not very successful.
Yeah, as sad as it makes me, I do have to agree with you. The Libertarians must be sacrificed on the altar of the Democrats.
What about the Greens, though? Is Jill Stein still a thing?
There is a Green candidate. I'm sure. I don't think it's Jill Stein, though.
It's not Jill Stein, I know,
No.
but all the same.
Maybe they can give them good tickets to one of their inaugural balls or something. They can pay them off in some nice way. But yeah, I mean, if we rather than talking about issues, just with the electoral system that the US has, and the fact that this time we have to get rid of Donald Trump, nothing else should be even considered. That should be laser focus from everyone who is not in his circle.
Agreed. And on that note, I think we'll wrap up there, folks. I hope this episode of the podcast hasn't. His half-life hasn't expired by the time it airs, but we live in hope.
I did check my Twitter feed halfway through this podcast just to make sure that nothing major had broken. But at this stage,
I haven't had any push notifications on my phone.
Nah.
So
Okay, I got one, but I turned it off. I'm gonna look up my phone and discover that Vermin Supreme has somehow managed to win.
I'm just expecting a push notification is just going to be one day, isn't it? It's going to be earthquakes at Yellowstone, eruption imminent. It's like, okay, great while it lasted.
Indeed.
Okay, thanks everyone for tuning in, and we'll be keeping you updated with the election as per usual, and we'll see you very soon. Thanks for joining.
Care.